These two have no idea what they're about to walk into. Down here to have a good time, they figure, why not give poker a try? After all, how different can it be from the home games they've played their whole lives? All the luck in the world isn't going to change things for these guys. They're simply overmatched.
Welcome to the Daily Dose. So I work as what's called a technical consultant. What I do is I go from startup to startup or small business to small business, and I set up their network infrastructure, their internet connections, and sometimes even their website and their databases, things like that. I've been doing this for about 6 years now, and most of the businesses I've worked with have been led by men, but a few of them have been led by women. Over the years, I've noticed a consistent pattern of behaviors that customers and clients use to try and establish some sort of negotiating leverage over you, or just any kind of dominance over you in the relationship in general. It seems to be an unspoken rule of engagement. A typical example might be a client will always reschedule a meeting, or will never take a meeting that you propose, but will always counter with his time instead. So for example, if I'm on the phone with a client and we're trying to set up a meeting, I might propose Tuesday at 1, and he will counter with, I can't do that, but how about 2:30? It seems very small, and it is. It's very trivial. But if that's a consistent pattern of behavior from this particular individual, this is a power move. It's a very small power move. It's what they would call a microaggression in an SJW type context. Most clients do this. It's just part of the game we play. Nothing to really get worked up over. Another very typical example is being late for a meeting. Obviously, I would never be late for a meeting, at least not on purpose. But if let's say we do set up that meeting at 2:30, and I would then arrive at typically 2:25, but my client wouldn't be ready until 2:45. This happens all the time. It's another pattern of behavior. It's an unspoken rule of engagement. They're basically playing a game. They're basically playing a game without literally playing a game. Occasionally, this power struggle would have to be more overt. For me, usually that line is crossed when matters of payment arise. So for example, my contracts typically require a 2-week invoicing cycle, and if my previous invoice isn't paid before the next one, I just stop working on the contract until the payment is settled. So that's a bit more of an overt situation, but that is also part of the power struggle. To be clear, the female-led businesses did this too, but they also had a different set of issues that were distinctly female-oriented. First and foremost, they tended to have a big chip on their shoulders. They seemed out to prove that they can compete in a world dominated by men as women. That seemed to be a primary objective of theirs beyond the actual success of the business itself. One of these clients literally told me that was the case. She wasn't even being subtle about it. She flat out told me that was one of her objectives. One of the ways this manifested in all of my female-led clients was that they only hired other women in senior leadership positions. So the head of marketing, the head of legal, these would all be women. Even the assistants would all be women. I guess assistants are typically women anyway, but the point is, in any position of business consequence, the role was always filled by a woman. What I always found funny, though, was that when it came down to do the hardcore technical challenges, they called me in, a man. When they had to set up a scalable private architecture in the cloud, they called me in. When they had database failures, they called me. When they detected a security breach, guess who? Now, I'm not saying women couldn't do those jobs. Obviously, there are female engineers who are highly capable and can perform those roles. What I am saying is that the female clients I had drew the line at this point as far as their female empowerment goes, and they hired a man to do this job. Things got even more interesting when one of my female clients would have to fulfill a male role and step into a situation that they weren't completely comfortable with. This typically came down to negotiation or some sort of conflict resolution. In one such case, my client was late on an invoice that was submitted 2 weeks prior to our meeting. She had then proceeded to explain to me that invoices are typically given a 30-day grace period to be paid, whereas written in the actual work-for-hire contract, it clearly stated that there was a 2-week turnaround on every invoice. Now, I will say, to her credit, this is a very typical move, and most of my male clients do the same thing. What they try to do is explain to me how the business works. This happens all the time. This is a very typical move. So this particular female client read her management guides very well that day. However, her body language betrayed her. I could sense her unease with the entire situation. Her voice was shaky. She was not making eye contact. She was trembling a little bit, and she was not entirely confident with her dominance in this situation because she didn't have it. So I handled it gracefully, and I told my client, that's fine, but moving forward, we will maintain our 2-week invoicing cycle, and if you are late even one day, that is my last day, and that's where we left it. Well, obviously that day came and went, and I dropped the client. They were completely caught off guard by this and simply did not know how to handle the situation. Furthermore, they cannot use their female nature to their advantage in this case, because we are now in a business context, and I certainly was not interested in them romantically. They tried to compel me to continue working under the threat of a lawsuit, but I clearly pointed out a clause in the agreement stating that either party could terminate the agreement within 3 days' notice. So I told them I will work for 3 more days and then I am finished. Welcome to a man's reality. So that was exactly what happened, and as far as I could tell, about 6 months later, their company went under. Can't run a business if you don't have a website. In another scenario where one of my female clients had to assume a male role, we were negotiating an ownership clause under a situation where the contract may break down and both parties walk away, the question of who owns what's called the tech stack. Under US law, the person who set up the actual technology owns the stack. That would be myself. But she didn't see it that way, and she wanted to make sure she retained ownership under any scenario. I didn't really care, to be honest, because I had no interest in running away with her business. However, she was so paranoid about this, she insisted that we had this clause ironed out before we began working. So I said, fine, let's set up a meeting, and we will get this clarified before beginning our engagement. Well, when we had that meeting, much to my surprise, she brought in her father. Her father was there negotiating on her behalf. This is a woman of around age 30 who brought in her father to negotiate on her behalf. After going back and forth for about 15-20 minutes, I said, look, it's fine, I don't care, you own everything I do, no matter what happens with the contract, because I don't want to deal with this headache. So we left it at that, and from that point forward, the contract worked out fine. At the very least, I got a free meal out of it. Her father did have the courtesy to pay for my lunch that day, which was nice. At the end of the day, one commonality I noticed amongst these situations is that basically these women were trying to embody a role that they were not suited to fill, and they were clearly uncomfortable doing so. At least in the last case, she was so uncomfortable she called in her father to handle it for her. Whereas from my vantage point as a man running a business, this is just every day for me. Dealing with these petty negotiations, these little power struggles, the constant back and forth that happens in any kind of business. I've had more than a few male clients where we've gone head to head on issues on a certain day, and then at the end of that day, we'd go out for a few drinks and have fun watching the football game. For what it's worth, this seems to be more of a European thing than an American thing. But women, however, cannot compartmentalize in this fashion, at least not naturally. I think this may have a lot to do with them not being aware of the rules of engagement, these rules that as men we grow up with since we were little boys. A common trope is that when boys fight, they'll duke it out and then they'll just move on the next day as if nothing happened. Well, this is true. I've certainly experienced that when I was a child, and much of that translates over into the business world as well. When I'm in the middle of a negotiation, I do not let it affect me emotionally, and I can certainly look beyond that and still have a drink with the very individual I'm negotiating against that very same day and probably enjoy myself. I think this is a foreign concept to women and something I can only appreciate from the other side of the table. When I was younger, high school and college age, I certainly did not understand the rules of engagement as it applied to courtship. More than once, especially in college, a girl would display subtle hints showing interest in me that I completely would not pick up on and thus not act upon. Over time, that girl's affection would morph into resentment and then eventually into hostility. And this happened multiple times, and I was very, very confused by it. Because I was so inept with girls at that age, I did not know the rules of engagement. Or probably the other way around. Because I did not know the rules of engagement, I was so inept with girls at that age. According to those rules, I was rejecting these girls, the few that expressed interest at least. And that's where the hostility arose. By and large, most men learn to adapt to these rules of engagement at some point in their lives. For me, it was a little bit later, during the college years, and once figured out, we navigate this landscape of the mating game, for the most part successfully. Most men do eventually get a girlfriend, get married, and have kids. However, the point is, the adjustment is on our end. We have to adjust to the rules of engagement as dictated to us, not by us. After all, as all MGTOW men know, women are the deciders, and when playing by their rules, we are forced to adapt. We are the ones who have to make money. We are the ones who have to earn status. We are the ones who have to lift weights and get in great shape and develop a sense of humor and build businesses and discover new chemical compounds and build rocket ships, etc., etc. We adapt. However, when I find that the roles are reversed and women are forced to abide by our rules of engagement, their response is quite different. Their natural inclination is to bring in a man to do the job for them, as was the case for my client who brought in her father to negotiate on her behalf. But on a macro level, it is to actually change those rules to suit their pleasure. This is where we are today, gentlemen. The feminist movement, gynocentric culture, Me Too, etc. These are all manifestations of that impulse. And as always, we are the ones who are forced to adapt. And that is what MGTOW is. Yet another adaptation. But for the first time in human history, we are eschewing the rules of engagement entirely and just creating our own. This is a very pivotal point in our evolution as a society, and I do not know how it will turn out. But I can tell you this from my own personal experience. Every time I dropped a female client, they eventually went out of business.